to have on the show Harrison Mann. He served in the U.S. Army for 13 years, rising to the rank of major. He was the first in the U.S. military and first from the intelligence community to resign over the U.S.'s policy in Gaza. He's also the first Jewish U.S. government official to resign over that, effective in June. Harrison, nice to see you. Thanks so much for being on.
Thanks for having me.
Sure. So, my friend, first of all, let's talk about your story. What first attracted you to get involved in the U.S. Army, to sign up and to work in that?
Yeah, I graduated high school and entered college at kind of the height of the global war on terror. So this is a decision I made in like 2008, 2009, when I was 19 years old, and at that time, I didn't have as much of a grasp on the geopolitics, but I sort of understood this was this important venture that the United States was engaged in, and I both felt that it could be my duty to participate in it, and I had this idea that the Army was going to be a bit of an adventure and develop me and make me a stronger person. So that got me in initially, and I continued to stay as new and more interesting opportunities were presented to me.
Did you enjoy it? I mean, was it what, except for near the end, obviously, when you resigned, was it what you thought it was going to be and you're working in the intelligence community? Like, were you able to, were you making a difference in the way you wanted to that motivated you to join in the first place?
Yeah, I started out on in the infantry, so it's like running around with armored vehicles and sleeping in the mud basically. And I felt like that wasn't quite for me. But then I started entering subsequent positions that were regional specialist jobs for the Middle East. And I already spoke a little bit of Arabic, and I felt like that was a field where I could really utilize my own talents and work at a higher, closer to the strategic level. And so, I had jobs. My last position before I came to DC was at the embassy in Tunisia, and I sort of did feel like we were helping advance an important regional strategy and helping a worthy partner. And then once I got to the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is the last place I worked, I also felt like I worked somewhere where we were giving important information to policymakers that was enabling them to make wiser decisions.
Is that what DI? That's what DIA. That's what it's called.
Yeah, so
DIA.
DIA is the Defense Intelligence Agency. It's a little bit like a smaller CIA that mainly serves the Pentagon, but it does a lot of the
Right.
same functions, and a lot of it is doing analysis to inform the Secretary of Defense, but also the President and every other U.S. policymaker.
Oh, that's good. I'm glad that you shared that because I wasn't really sure of how it all intersected.
Yeah.
That's what I was trying to get at. So, when you were working and you first heard about the October 7th terrorist attack by Hamas, what was your reaction? What was the reaction of the Defense Intelligence Administration
Yeah,
agency?
so at that time, I was working basically as the assistant to a fairly senior bureaucrat who was in charge of all analysis for the Middle East and Africa, and who was subsequently in charge of the agency's crisis response to October 7th, to include both
Hmm.
informing American policymakers and intel cooperation with our regional partners, including Israel. So that's where I was working, in the office that was going to be in charge of the response. And the initial attack was to all of us kind of surprising and horrific. I knew, and I think everybody suspected, that the Israeli response was going to be something really violent and unprecedented. But when I got back to the office that week, we really were treating it as, I could call it a normal crisis, because everybody I worked with was an intel veteran who'd been through this drill before, whether it was
Hmm.
the Sudanese civil war or the Afghanistan evac or the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which I also worked on. So, once we got into the office, we were really treating it like any other topic. There was a lot of urgency, and there was an ethos that Israel was in trouble, and we basically needed to give them anything they wanted to support them. But at the same time, there was no discussion at any level about the connection between our support or U.S. policy and the massive civilian casualties that we were seeing.
So, in the beginning, I imagine it was horrific attack. Let's support
Yep.
Netanyahu in this war and responding and keeping the people of Israel safe. And then it evolves. I mean, for all of us, because I think most people out there said, well, of course, the nation of Israel has a right to defend itself against a terrorist attack, right? So that wasn't really disputed too much, except for maybe teeny corners of society overall.
Mhm.
Then it became the reaction that we saw, and we saw images on TV of civilian destruction and casualties and collective punishment that I've never seen in my life. Honestly, I mean, it just off the charts. When did you first start seeing that? I don't know. I don't mean the exact date. I mean, in the time frame, was it a few weeks in, a month later? Like what, at some point, when was the first time you became alarmed and said, this is not normal, what we're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was aware as soon as you and anybody who had, a Twitter or a YouTube account about the kind of really tragic images of carnage we were seeing. Um, I think that the not normal sense came from when it didn't stop, because, like I said, we expected a disproportionate and violent indiscriminate reaction from Israel. That's kind of part of their playbook. What was really unique was that it didn't stop, and traditionally these kind of operations stop when the U.S. president puts his foot down, and that you can trace that
Right.
back to any number of Israeli wars, going back to the probably the 73 war. And so I think what really began to dishearten me and surprise me was mounting evidence even just in that first month, because I submitted my resignation papers in November, that regardless of the massive destruction to life and also civilian infrastructure, there was not going to be any change in the level of support that the U.S. was offering.
And I'm talking with Harrison Mann. He served in the U.S. Army for 13 years, rose to the rank of major, and resigned over Gaza policy. And was while you resigned in November, it wasn't effective to June, so you couldn't speak until just a few months ago about this. So when did we have an ability? Was it just words that we could say through our administration to Netanyahu saying what you're doing is going beyond the pale, or we think you're violating international human rights law? Or was there more than words that we could have done to slow down or even stop what we saw?
Yeah, the United States has more leverage over the state of Israel than probably any other country in the world. So they're entirely dependent on munitions from us, especially in a war like this, where in the first couple of weeks they were burning through their bombs and their artillery shells and their tank shells. So they were especially dependent on material from the U.S. And there's really no substitute for that. To a lesser extent, they are dependent on U.S. intelligence support, which is part of what my office provided, because they it's not a big country. They have certain advanced capabilities, but they don't necessarily know what's going on in the entire region, and not as well as the United States does. And then there's of course the diplomatic cover that we gave really intensely, especially at the outset of the war, and turning down vetoing UN resolutions that were trying to hold Israel accountable. So I think a credible threat, especially of reducing our arms transfers, would have done it. And even today, I'm hearing indirectly people in the administration who say, we didn't want to restrict arms because that was just going to make Netanyahu mad, and it wasn't actually going to affect Israel's behavior. But I have to say, even by the accounts of Israeli officials, they would have just run out of ammo a long time ago, if not for us. And they just would have been physically unable to continue prosecuting this war. So we had, and still have, I would say, near infinite leverage over them stopping or taming their operations.
And we didn't do that.
No, we never did. And I was also able to kind of witness some conversations in that first month in the intel world, that basically had concerns that we might be connected to potential war crimes or violations of human rights due to our relationship with our Israeli counterparts, and determined in the end that we would just accept, what we term the credible assurances of our Israeli counterparts, and call it a day. It's the same thing we do for arms sales. So once I saw that, I kind of understood that at no level was this going to be challenged. And unfortunately, I basically right up to now, we have not
Right.
seriously moderated our support.
You mentioned the 2,000-pound bombs that we provided the state of Israel, which they dropped on Gaza, one of the most densely populated areas in the world. And CNN did a great job about
Hmm.
satellite images of the craters that they caused, huge
Yeah.
craters. So I can't remember the exact number now. I believe well over 100. I can't be exact, but
Yeah.
2,000-pound bombs they talked about could maim or kill people a quarter mile away from the actual target. So even if you're in good faith saying Hamas is in this building and you're killing everyone within a quarter-mile radius in a densely populated area, it's going to cause grave amount of civilian casualties. Is that correct? What I just said? I mean, you're the military guy. I'm just telling you what I read in CNN. So without
Yeah.
sharing it, not breaching any kind of
I mean,
intelligence. I know you've left, but I just trying to get a sense. Is that accurate?
the 2,000-pound bombs, 500-pound bombs, and also the 155 millimeter artillery rounds that we also furnish Israel with. All of these have wide blast radiuses that go from hundreds of meters and beyond, and then the maximum circumference where somebody can be injured or catch a piece of shrapnel is much wider. So it is impossible to use any of those systems in a dense urban area and be confident that you're not going to hit civilians. Even if you're aiming exactly at the military target you want to hit, you are definitely going to hit a lot of other things around it.
And I'm not sure what you're allowed to say and not, but in terms of intelligence that we provided to Netanyahu administration, did they use that? I mean, were there warnings that were given like, hey, Hamas might be in this building, but it might not be the safest thing for everyone around it to drop a massive bomb on there, as opposed to, let's say, doing a commando raid. And what I'm getting at is I had Congressman Jason Crow on, who was a former Army Ranger. He was
Yeah,
very critical of Israel's response. He said, you should not. He said from the beginning, telling them, don't drop big bombs there. You send people
yeah.
in, you go after the people who target you want, and you leave. If not, you're going to make this worse in the bigger picture. So my question is, was that kind of advice given to Netanyahu from people in our administration?
There were a lot of attempts to ask Israeli counterparts to take more measures to protect civilian life. So that ask has been presented at multiple levels more than once.
Right.
But at this point, it's on us. If we keep asking, they functionally ignore it, and there's no consequences. So sure, we asked.
Okay, fair enough. I mean, look, I mean, it depends on your point of view of the situation. I had Senator Bernie Sanders on, and we talked about how the U.S. is complicit in this. Um,
Absolutely.
in January, I had a meeting with Secretary Blinken and about 7 or 8 other Palestinian Americans, and it was the hardest meeting I've ever been to in my entire life. And that I have no family in Gaza. My family's in the West Bank. They were there. People were crying, showing him images of family who were killed by
Mhm.
U.S. armaments. And the secretary was moved. There's no doubt about it. And it seemed if he could have maybe had an impact, he could have. This was January. We can't tell after it ended if he's not an actor. He was moved. I mean, we know that. Was he powerless, or we can't get a sense of the hierarchy who makes the decisions on this? And is there any insight you can give into that?
Yeah, I think it's the president and then the Secretary of State who you met with to a large extent, and to a lesser extent, the Middle East coordinator on the NSC, Brett McGurk, and to a maybe lesser extent, the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. So I think any of those people, if they say they're powerless, that's just not entirely truthful. Because as I said, we have incredible leverage. And what we've been doing over the past 11 months is repeatedly teaching Netanyahu that we will not use the leverage no matter what he does. And that's a policy decision made by Secretary Blinken and made by the president.
I'm not saying Secretary Blinken said he was powerless. He wouldn't say that.
Oh,
We just
forgive
wondered
me.
after the meeting, like, because he said all these things to us that he wanted to do and change, and he was just literally going back like the next day back. This is in January, and he goes, "I think we're going to get a deal," and and I don't think he was faking. I think they thought there was going to somebody on our side thought there was going to deal, and on Netanyahu's side, who just literally said 2 weeks ago, "There's not even a chance of a deal. It's not even close." And I applaud people like Congressman Gerald Nadler, who's actually my congressman in New York, who said point blank in July that Netanyahu's imposing conditions that we didn't even want, that were agreed to, and then imposing new conditions to keep the
Yes.
war going on to stay in power. And is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think that's actually absolutely true about Netanyahu, and I give the administration more credit. I am doubtful that they were repeatedly tricked or bamboozled by Netanyahu for months on end, and I think they're smarter than that. So I
Right.
have trouble believing that that they kept feeling like Charlie Brown with Lucy pulling the football away from them since January.
No, and I'm not
And
right. And there's nothing in my tone to suggest that
yes,
we are powerless. We didn't have the power to stop that. We could have stopped it. It's interesting you said 1973 Yom Kippur War, and Golda Meir was like going into Egypt, and the U.S. said stop. Don't do it. Henry
mm-hmm.
Kissinger famously. Other
Yes,
times with George W. Bush, when the U.S.
absolutely.
said stop, they would stop. In this case, not. And Netanyahu's a unique character. He understood that if he stopped this war and agreed to any ceasefire, then he loses people like Smotrich and Ben Gvir. They're far right people who say,
Mm-hmm.
if you do a ceasefire, we're leaving. He leaves the government. He's powerless. His
Certainly.
trial goes on. Maybe he's convicted. I think from an intelligence point of view, at some point he'll be held accountable. October 7th must be viewed as one of the worst intelligence failures in the history of modern era warfare,
Yeah.
because it's not like someone even hijacking planes. This is the people that you've surrounded with sophisticated surveillance, that there's a militant group in there, and they were able to come over with pickup trucks, and the fighter jets didn't get there for hours. What do you have any sense of that? Anything you can share about what happened on October 7th in that regard?
Yeah, I'll just briefly say, yeah, it was an intel failure and a larger policy failure. I've heard people talk about, well, we got to make sure Hamas can't do another October 7th. I mean, October 7th was very preventable on October 6th. And so, yeah, the decision to ignore intel assessments that Israeli officials were giving, and the decision to concentrate troops in the West Bank instead of closer to Gaza, where they could have reacted, right? That was a policy decision made by the Israeli government, made by Netanyahu, that was entirely preventable.
And was there, like, you gave your resignation in November, and I'll touch on the letter in a second. Was there any specific one thing where you're like, I cannot morally be a part of this anymore? Or was it just building up over the weeks of watching what was going on?
Yeah, one big event was the 17 October explosion at Al Ahli Hospital. And that was a moment where there was extreme sort of trepidation in the intel community that I could feel, that if it turned out to be Israel, that was going to be a big deal. And this was back when them hitting a hospital was something unthinkable, and that might actually force a policy change. The IC's analysis concluded that it actually was not Israel, with an errant rocket from another group. And then, after that sort of initial period of hope that we might actually change our support, there was never that level of scrutiny again, despite subsequent instances when it was very clear that Israel was striking hospitals. And so I think that, coupled with the understanding that credible assurances was going to be as far as we were going to go in terms of making sure we weren't part of illegal or criminal acts, and a big sense of resignation amongst some of our senior leadership, who it was clear, basically they communicated not just we're going to support Israel, but we're kind of along for the ride, like it or not. We've just got to do this. And I wasn't used to seeing those men with that kind of demeanor. So all of that made me feel quite, both hopeless and kind of powerless. And so I realized, every day that I kept going back to the office, I was going to be part of this, and I was going to be contributing to the killing.
So when you say, like, these leaders in the administration or that you work with, was it not
Within the
a
intel
typical
community.
reaction where they, right, in the intel community? Okay, so this sense of we're going along for the ride.
Yeah.
Do you get a sense what motivated that?
Yeah, I mean, listen. We all have the same boss, and if you're told you're going to support Israel no matter what, even if you can see them doing something that looks destructive and counterproductive, and they do surprising things that they don't tell the Americans about the day before, you still have to do it.
So when you say the top, President Joe Biden.
Yeah.
All right, fair enough. I'm not trying to make this into a deposition. I used to be a lawyer, so
But I mean, it's
I want this a
policy.
conversation, but there are facts I'm trying to figure out myself. I mean, I read stuff that you were interviewed and other things you said, but I was just intrigued by that. And I want listeners too to get a full sense without holding back any punches about exactly what went on. People can pass their judgment what they want. I mean, Joe Biden's not the nominee in 2024. It's a different conversation that we are having right now. So in your resignation letter that you submitted in November, you talked about being Jewish and that the importance of never again and not just following orders, and that you talked about haunted by the knowledge that I fail those principles. What can you share with people? And we have many listeners who are Jewish. Like, what was it about your Jewish identity that said, I can't be a part of this anymore?
I think I was raised, very culturally Jewish, more than observant, but we with a big understanding of the history of European Jews, and also a real sense of lack of forgiveness or tolerance for people who were associated with crimes against Jews, even if it wasn't directly. And so there was no question that it was just that, a concentration camp guard went on trial, even though he's not the mastermind, or there was no questioning that IBM was at fault for supplying software that the Nazis used in concentration camp operations, even though they weren't the ones pulling the trigger. And I had a very clear idea of how history views people like that. And the line from me to the Israeli military, to what they were doing, was just as short of as that, if not shorter. And I could think of a lot of clever excuses to say, like, well, I'm working for my boss, and he does a lot of other things, and we are not the ones pulling the triggers over Gaza. But it was impossible to avoid my acknowledging my involvement in it, and especially impossible not to think about how this would look in 5 or 10 years, where my excuses would not mean much. And finally, like, these are not analogous situations, but when you back then, and especially now, you look at what's happening to people in Gaza, it's another kind of undesired population who the world doesn't care about, who is confined, who is being starved, and who's being killed at the leisure of a more powerful state. And like, I think it's hard for me to imagine how no people cannot draw the line between that and some of the Jewish experience in Europe.
I know, and I appreciate that very much. I'm chatting with Harrison Mann. So when you look, I'm not asking for like a legal answer in a way, but
Yeah.
when you look at the way that the Israeli military used the weaponry provided them, were you concerned they violated international law on these in certain circumstances?
Yeah, absolutely. Distinction is a principle of international humanitarian law, which is to say making sure you're distinguishing between combatants and civilians. And as we discussed, if you're using these weapons with a 300-meter, 1,000-meter circular area of proper probability, which is like basically the radius in which somebody can potentially get injured, there's a 50% chance you'll get injured by projectile landing it's impossible to ensure that you're even taking minimal measures to not harm civilians. And coupled with that, from the first days of the war through now, you have the Israeli Minister of Defense saying, cut off their food, cut off their water. So the intent for mass punishment is extremely clear. And there's every public statement from an Israeli politician just reaffirms that, and that it's not, well, we tried to drop bombs on the fighters, and like, whoops, we hit some civilians. They keep reiterating through speech and action a desire to punish the entire civilian population, and that is illegal.
I tell people who want to defend what Israel's doing and Netanyahu's doing, you have every right to defend it. You understand you're defending a war crime. I mean, it's collective punishment. It is textbook collective punishment, which is a violation of international law. There's no doubt about that, zero doubt. President Biden himself said that Israel was engaged in, quote, indiscriminate bombing. That is a war crime. I mean, the president even said that in December when he was talking about it. Not to make this political at all, but Vice President Harris used vastly different language, which is very important in terms of talking about Palestinians as human beings. And she called for a ceasefire in March before President Obama. I mean, President Biden. I'm sure it was internally discussions about it, but they are different people. And my hope is that there'd be a different path going forward. When you resigned and your resignation got public, what was the response of your peers and friends in the intelligence community?
Yeah, so because it takes a long time to leave the Army, I kept working in the office through the beginning of April. And then I left. I first, before I publicized it, I distributed my resignation letter around the office. I talked to my boss, the deputy, the senior people who I worked with. And I was incredibly scared to do that because I hadn't heard anybody say one word since October, about the things that I was feeling and about any objection to the destruction in Gaza.
Right.
But to my surprise, a lot of people were really receptive. They were really supportive. They told me, I totally get it. I don't like this either. I feel guilty about this. I don't like this policy. And that was quite validating and affirming to me that we have a lot of people, I think, in our national security bureaucracies who do know that this is wrong, and for either, I would say, professional or material reasons, don't feel like they're able to speak out and don't feel like they're able to quit.
What about friends in the Jewish community? Did you get any reaction from them to this?
My grandmother was born in British Mandate Palestine. They're a family of Hungarian
Oh,
Jews who moved there. So my family is connected to this, and I think I'm fortunate that the Jews in my life were also understanding, and I know that my decision facilitated some conversations that helped them get on the same page as me.
hmm.
There's come from my parents' generation are people who I think a lot of them were just not exposed to criticism of Israel in the public sphere until maybe this October.
That's interesting that how that evolves. When Netanyahu says his goal is the elimination of Hamas in Gaza, from a military point of view, is that possible? And is that possible? And is it something that should be the focus when you realize to do that, you have to kill even more civilians than he's already has?
Yeah, so per both U.S. and Israeli government officials, it's not possible. But I have to add the caveat that there is one way to do it, and it's the way that they're working towards, which is if you kill everybody in Gaza, there will be no Hamas. And I have to just mention that grim possibility because the trajectory we're on with no medical aid entering or minimal and minimal food entering, I there are Israeli politicians who see that as the solution, but in a way that does not kill everybody in Gaza. No, you can't easily defeat these people who have hundreds of miles of tunnels, and you can kill whichever leader, you can kill Sinwar, but you're not going to remove the fact that there's a lot of people in Gaza who are really have a grudge against Israel, and especially now that they've suffered even yet again at the hands of the Israeli government. So you're not going to defeat that ideology with force.
I mean, from your point of view as well, when you look at the more activity in the West Bank, this Netanyahu administration has confiscated more land than any administration since 1993, the Oslo
Mhm.
Accords. They've also killed, plus I think it's over 500 in the
Yeah.
last in this year in the West Bank. And they have major operations. They were just recently in Jenin, destroying the infrastructure and the
Yes.
streets there. Is there? Can you get a sense what the goal is there? Is it the idea of making it unlivable in certain places? So in effect, it's effectively ethnic cleansing without doing it that way, make it unlivable and people leave, or that's the hope.
Yes, I mean, I think Janine's a preview of what's to come. October 7th was both a tragedy for Israelis and looked like a God-given opportunity to the right wing bloc that supports Netanyahu to finally take this land back for Jewish Israelis. And given that they have succeeded so far in Gaza, basically unimpeded by the U.S., they're
Mhm.
they're trying it in the West Bank now. And I think if at no point the U.S. administration, whoever it is, if they don't put their foot down, they're again communicating, hey, we didn't care if you did this in Gaza, really. You can now move on to the West Bank, and we're not going to stop you either. And we know that's what the Israeli right
Right.
wants.
Absolutely. Again, the right wing people he's brought in the administration, Netanyahu, I mean, one, Itamar Ben Gvir is a convicted terrorist. He was convicted in the Israeli court of being a terrorist. It's not supposition. We're not speculating. He invited a man into his government who's involved in terrorism against Arabs. And when you're against Arabs, it's against Christians and Muslims. This is a
Mhm.
man who's a supremacist, as part of Jewish power. And, it's interesting with the meeting with Secretary Blinken, we're not permitted to say exactly what he said. I can tell you what I said to him. I said, what's going to happen when they go on the West Bank and do the same thing?
Mhm.
And all I can say, I can't quote him exactly because of the rules, but he indicated, well, we've told them that's not acceptable. I go, but what are you going to do? You've told them it's not acceptable, but what are you going to do? And the look was like, well, they're never going to do that. Of course. Are you kidding me? I could see this coming. I could see where this was heading. This was the dream of the greater Israel that the far right in Israel, not mainstream Jews, and certainly not ones who were just culturally Jewish, the far right, which is the backbone of this coalition, dream of a river to the sea where the Christians and Muslims who live there either will be under oppression or be driven out or killed. I mean, that's the world that they live in. That's what they want. And that's their stated policy. I mean, you literally have Israeli ministers writing in Hebrew, because my fiance is Israeli. She's Palestinian, but she's born and raised in Israel. She's in Haifa right now. Well, read the stuff that they're saying. There's never going to be a Palestine. We want river to the sea. They are saying it. If you say that America as a Palestinian, you get expelled from school. You say in Israel, you get more votes. I mean, you got to be honest here. We have to have an honest conversation about this for those people who really want a peace for both people where they can live in peace, and mothers who are Palestinian and Israeli don't have to fear their children are killed by a missile or a militant going forward. But we can't have those honest conversations. We're going to have even more stifling if the Senate passes and then the House a new definition of anti-Semitism, which includes you can't criticize Zionism, which to me, it's not about Zionism. It's these words mean nothing at this point. It's about occupation and oppression or people living together with self-determination and human rights. But, again, they're going to play games. So, I mean, what do you see? You're not a politician. You're a military person. Looking forward, is there a way that there can be coexistence and hope for it, or there's extreme movements on both sides? I mean, there's still Hamas and there's still far right people on the Palestinian side. Overwhelmingly, I think people want to live their lives. And I think in Israeli society, there is a far right, and I think there's a big middle who want to live their lives.
Yeah, I'm still very much thinking about, I think emergency medicine and stemming the bleeding versus the long term. But I'm going to bring it back to the same fundamental point, which is that if the most powerful country in the world promises unlimited support to any Israeli government, no matter what they do, there cannot be peace. And this is not, Israel's a unique country, but I think if you chose any country in the world, I don't know what your favorite country is, Armenia, Bolivia, Bangladesh, and the United States said, hey, for 50 years, we're going to give you as much armament, protection from the U.S. Navy, intelligence, diplomatic cover as you want, no matter what you do. They would take some actions that we would be quite surprised by when they start to feel invulnerable. They have their own border disputes and grievances that, because they don't feel invincible, they are not acting on them brutally. And so there is going to be no reason for any Israeli government, and Israel continues to move to the right politically, to moderate its behavior without consequences. And the United States is the only country that can impose consequences, I would say, in a peaceful way. We're now perhaps moving to Israel discovering how its regional rivals will impose consequences as it continues to pursue escalation in the north.
And I'm caught in this weird world between two worlds in a way, because my family's in the West Bank, so I have to fear the Israeli military going after them. And then Hen, my fiance, his family's in Haifa, and she's in Haifa, so I have to worry about Hezbollah missiles, which literally destroyed the Haifa train station when she was there years ago. And she will call me. She's in a bomb shelter. And you never have more coexistence of Jews and Muslims and Christians sitting together like in a bomb shelter, fearing a Hezbollah missile coming to kill all of them. And now you've got what happened, and we'll talk about it now because I want to get your point of view as a military person. What happened today, if people don't know, in Lebanon, at least 8 killed, if not 9, 2,700 Lebanese, and they're identified apparently by Hezbollah as being part of Hezbollah, and that their pagers blew up. And what more I gave a shorthand, but what more can you share? And you were telling before we came on that you knew more now about it, because it didn't make sense to me. I'm like, something's going on. I don't get it. So what can you share?
Yeah, so just the most recent I've read, and this is from Al Monitor, which is a good site for regional news, is that this is an operation that Israel started 5 months ago, and they intercepted a shipment of pagers that Hezbollah wanted to use and inserted plastic explosives into them that could be detonated by calling the pagers in a certain way. And so today, they detonated all of them, and it sounds like there's like over 1,000. It's not clear. It sounds like most, but not all, were held by Hezbollah operatives or members. And then I've got to mention that includes civil servants and people who work for the political party, not just fighters. And blew them all up because apparently their plot was about to get discovered, or it was on the verge of discovery by Hezbollah, and so they realized they had to either use it now or it wasn't going to work ever. And this, of course, yeah, killed 2,700 people. This was also an indiscriminate attack. It did target Hezbollah, but these people were at home in the supermarket, and so a lot of people were injured. And this is the latest act in a increasing pattern of Israeli efforts to escalate the conflict with Hezbollah. Hezbollah sort of started it on October 8th. They said in solidarity with Hamas, we're going to start doing cross-border strikes on military targets. But since then, they've repeatedly emphasized they do not want a larger war, and they will cease fire and stop shooting into Israel as soon as there's a ceasefire in Gaza. They call it a solidarity front. Israel has targeted different senior leaders throughout Lebanon. A month or two ago, they hit a senior officer in Beirut, and then they did this attack today. And it seems increasingly clear that Netanyahu expects and wants a larger war with Lebanon, based off his actions and based off his rhetoric, and that should horrify people in Israel, people in Lebanon, people elsewhere in the region. And if we have time, I want to briefly talk about why this is scary and why this is another reason that American pressure is urgent. There's any Israeli administration would have a problem right now because we have maybe 60,000 plus Israelis displaced from the north because of these attacks who need to go back. Mm-hmm. In reality, the only way to get Hezbollah to cease its attacks is to achieve a ceasefire. They're dug into these mountain positions. They have these subterranean structures that are much more sophisticated than what Hamas has, and the Israeli military couldn't really even defeat those. So bombing is not going to take care of it, which means Israel's going to think they need to bomb Beirut as kind of a punishment tactic that they use, the Dahia doctrine, which maybe you're familiar with, and launch a ground operation into Lebanon. That's also going to be very hard fighting for them and probably be a disaster. It's also going to probably provoke Hezbollah to start using their extensive arsenal of drones, missiles, and rockets to strike deeper into Israel. And we've already seen both the Houthis and Hezbollah can bypass Israeli air defenses. If Hezbollah launches 1,000 missiles at once, which they can probably do if they want to, or tons of projectiles, we should be confident that they can hit Israeli population centers. That on its own is going to be disastrous for both countries. And then I'm especially worried that whoever the president is at this point will not be able to refuse Netanyahu's request for more direct American involvement.
You think American boots on the ground, American fighting, like fighter jets dropping bombs?
I would hope not boots on the ground, but I think, if I hate to say it, if Haifa is not getting hit by isolated rockets, but on fire, Tel Aviv, and Netanyahu is demanding that the U.S. help bomb Hezbollah targets in Lebanon, it's very difficult for me to imagine any U.S. president, Biden, Harris, certainly not Trump, to turn him down at a time where Israel really will look like a victim, and there will be civilian suffering in Israel, and there will be, probably disturbing images coming out of the Israeli homeland. And so I think at very least we can expect that, and that leads us down a far more dangerous path if Hezbollah sees us as a combatant. We have a lot of facilities that are in the area, embassies, big bases that are vulnerable, and there's a lot of pathways where that. Go ahead, yeah, drags us in.
No, I was going to say no because we've gone long, which is great going along, but we're getting along where I'm going to have to take a break and let you go in a second. But the question I had for you is, are we at a place where Netanyahu is taunting Iran and Hezbollah because he believes the U.S. has got his back no matter what he does? And is there a continuing line from what we've done in Gaza by backing him 100% to this place where he's so emboldened, he might start a regional war thinking the U.S., I can start the war and I won't suffer any consequences. The U.S. is still going to get my back.
Yes, 100%. And just like we've taught him we won't cut arms for any reason, we've taught him we will protect him no matter what he does. And let's remind everybody that we sent multiple aircraft carriers into the region to protect him immediately after he ordered these assassination or targeted killings in both Tehran and Beirut, including the killing of the Hamas political chief in Tehran. 2 months ago. And he did that, very provocative, very escalatory. We immediately surged forces to the region to make sure that, again, he would have this sense of invincibility. So he absolutely counts on our support no matter what. And we've shown him that he's right about that.
It's frightening. And it really if Netanyahu had a bigger country, I think he would be like a Putin. I mean, I think his mindset, it's a very dangerous situation. We could have a regional war. Unfortunately, we have this person there. And well, it's been an eye-opening and alarming conversation, Harrison. And I don't know if you're on social media, if you want people to follow you, but I hope you come back on just to talk about issues that come up in the Middle East. I mean, you have a great point of view of your work in defense intelligence, and your understanding of actual combat. So I'd love you to come back on. And what you did was amazing. We have a mutual friend, Hala. I so admire and appreciate you standing up for your principles, even if it mean ending your military career as a major. But that's true to who you are as a person, and also your faith, being Jewish. And it's inspiring. Let me just say that.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me on.